I would like to welcome you to the Rochester Beacon's Alternative Energy for New York State, a focus on utility scale solar, offshore, wind, and hydrogen fuel cell. I'm Karen Hyder, your host, standing by behind the scenes, ready to turn things over to you, Kent Gardner, to begin when you're ready.
Well, ready to go, Karen. Thank you. Appreciate Karen's help today. And we're also very grateful for the support of our sponsors. Canandaigua National Bank and Trust has been around since 1887. It's the only local full-service, community-owned financial institution in the Rochester area, providing a full range of financial services to individuals, businesses, corporations, and municipalities. The New York State Pollution Prevention Institute is a collaboration of 5 research universities and manufacturing extension partnerships led by the Golisano Institute of Sustainability at RIT. To date, it's provided $2 million in support for community projects and assisted over 300 New York companies. So I'd like to do a bit of an introduction to the topic. I'm opinion editor at the Beacon and chief economist at the Center for Governmental Research. I'm interested in how attitudes towards climate change and attitudes towards climate policy have evolved over recent years. So I've pulled together some slides that summarize this. So we can take a look at some information from the Pew Research Center. Pew points out that support for climate change has gotten to 2/3, reducing the effect of global climate change support. Respond positively to the statement that the federal government is doing too little. And then we move on and take a look at, Karen? Thank you. We want to support for climate change is increasing. We go back to 2014 and only 29% support the argument that climate policy should be a top priority. That's up to 52% today. We also see, next slide. Yeah, we also see that 72% of Americans believe that global warming is actually happening. And that's a surprise. You go back 10 years or so and you wouldn't see that occurring. Let's go back one slide, please. I'd also like to point out that if you look at these numbers at a statewide level, West Virginia, which is of course a coal producing state, still supports this response positively to this statement at 59%. That's the lowest in the country. If you look at states like New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, you'll see that support tops out at more like 78%. So next one. We also know that Americans, we believe in technology. We're very supportive of the notion of funding alternative fuels research. Next slide. We also support tax rebates for purchases of energy efficient vehicles or solar panels. You know, once again, we need to excuse me just a moment here. There we go.
There you are. Now we see you.
Sorry about that. I had Karen's helping us behind the scenes here, sending us little messages saying, you know, you need to start your video, which is, I think, is a marvelous idea. So we know that there's significant support for purchases of energy efficient vehicles. Now, what's interesting about this and important to note is that this leaves discretion at the individual level. So people can say, I'm going to buy a solar vehicle. I've got this little nudge in the form of a rebate, or I'm going to buy solar panels because, once again, I'm getting supported for part of the cost of that. Next. And we also know that we've got a surprisingly large support, again, but 2/3 support for a carbon tax. This is near and dear to the hearts of economists. We think carbon taxes make a lot of sense, but that's something that has not been popular long term. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Then finally, we see this significant support requiring utilities to purchase 1/5 of their power from renewable sources. So less support there because I think people do know that that's going to affect their utility rates. So with that, let me introduce our speakers quickly. Grateful for the time that they have spent preparing and for the time they're taking today. I won't spend a lot of time talking about their background. You can see it on the screen. Cathy Spencer from Leases Associates has been spending a lot of time looking at solar projects. Ross Gould with the Business Network for Offshore Wind knows all things wind and will bring his experience to the conversation. And Dan O'Connell has been part of the hydrogen fuel cell effort here in the Finger Lakes for a long time. His early time at General Motors, and then he founded American Fuel Cell when General Motors left town, and now he's working with PlugPower. So with that, Cathy, I'm going to pass the torch to you.
Great, thank you, Kent. I'm so happy to be here with everyone. My name again is Cathy Spencer. I'm the Principal Environmental Analyst at Leases Associates. At Leases, we've been involved in all aspects of solar development in the last couple years, designing projects, building projects, working with the interconnections. But I just wanted to point out that my primary involvement in these solar projects has been really working with the local towns and counties to help them understand, what the project means as it comes into their town, what are the possible environmental impacts they need to be concerned about, and really how to get their input and feedback and their concerns logged into the process and back to the decision makers. So that's where most of my experience has been. Now, just stepping back for a moment, most of you probably know that renewable energy projects didn't really hit the scene in upstate New York until the early 2000s. At that time, we saw our first wind energy projects being built onshore or on the land, basically, not in the water, in different areas of upstate New York, like the southern tier especially, and along the St. Lawrence River. At that time, those projects were under town approval, and they were followed eventually by solar projects that came in really more in the last 5, 6, 7 years. Has been when they've really hit the scene. And I guess before we go much further, I wanted to just throw out a quick definition. When I'm talking that's especially relevant to solar projects, and that is community scale versus utility scale. Our utility scale projects are the bigger ones, and that's what we're going to focus my discussions on today. They are any projects over 25 megawatts. Some of them get very large, into the hundreds of megawatts, as we'll see. Community scale projects are generally those lower than 20 megawatts. They're typically in the 5 megawatt range. And those are the ones that you're seeing in the landscape now, if you're familiar with any of them. None of the utility scale projects that have been proposed in the last couple of years have been built yet. And we're going to talk a little bit about what's going to happen when they are built. So just to frame our discussion very briefly, like I said before, could you go back, keep to the former slide, please? Before 2011, when we were just seeing wind projects, they were being approved locally under the typical site plan review and environmental review process. That all changed when Article 10 was brought into being by the state, which then required a state siting and approval process for these utility scale wind and solar projects. So things kind of went along, but the game really was upped in 2019 when the governor passed the Climate Leadership Act, which set specific goals for how we're going to generate electricity in the state by certain target years. The one that's relevant to solar is that there's a goal of 6,000 megawatts to be generated by solar facilities by 2025, so coming right up. In 2020, The word accelerated is the key word here. The state, it appears the state believed that the Article 10 projects were not moving fast enough. They replaced that with a Section 94C law, which is what we're operating under today. So where are we and what's going on? You can go to the next slide, Karen. Thank you. Right now, in New York State, as of the end of 2020, NYSERDA estimates that there are about 2,800 megawatts of solar power being generated throughout the state. And that amount of generation is being done by community scale solar projects. The 2,800 megawatts is being generated by 145,000 projects. So doing the math, none of them are very big, right? They're all small, 2 megawatts, maybe 5 megawatts. All of those 145,000 projects add up to the current generation of 2,800 megawatts. What you see before you here in this slide is the projects awarded by NYSERDA in 2020. And if you can read the small print there, you'll see they're much bigger utility scale projects. So we're going to take our 2,800 of existing solar capacity, and we're going to add 200 megawatts here and 500 there and 94 in another project for a total in the pipeline shown in this slide of another 2,100 megawatts of power. So you can see New York State wants to ramp things up. They want utility scale solar to be able to increase that total generation capacity and meet the 6,000 megawatt goal. With the 2,800 megawatts we have operating now, what you see on the slide is about another 2,100, bringing us to 4,900 once these projects are operational, which may, still take the next couple of years to achieve. Next slide, please. So, so what does this mean in terms of maybe we can visualize and understand? I have on the screen a project that Labella was involved in. It's a 2 megawatt project located near Cornell. It encompasses 14 acres and there are 9,000 solar panels on the ground. So let's go back. This is a 2 megawatt project. Most of the projects utility scale that are being proposed and that you just saw on the last slide are 200 megawatts or 250 megawatts, or I don't know if you noticed the 500 megawatt project. So you can see what a 2 megawatt project does in this kind of rolling landscape. And I'm trying to give a sense here of the scale and magnitude of the projects that are now being proposed and are coming at us in upstate New York in the next couple years. And there are many of them. I guess to continue, let's go to the next slide. This is the town of Ripley. One of the projects Labella is working on is the South Ripley Solar Project. And I don't want to exaggerate my point here. The area you see in red is about 5,900 acres. And that was the area that was originally presented to the town as to what the developer would like to build, where the developer would like to build this facility in the town of Ripley. The actual as-built, when we actually get there, will be more like 1,400 acres, so about a quarter of the area in the red outline. But again, we put this slide together just to show you the scale of what we're talking about as the towns and counties are receiving the projects, what they're trying to envision, and even a quarter of this area as will be built is quite a bit of town land that is being occupied by solar panels. I have a couple more examples just to illustrate the point. This area, I think, is a little closer, I know, is closer to all of us in Rochester. We're looking at the very southwest corner of Monroe County and where it meets Livingston County. And the wavy outline that you see is the Genesee River making its way up to the city of Rochester. Could you go back a minute? Thank you. So in this slide, what you're seeing is all the parcels that the developer is dealing with, and the hatched area is the actual location of where solar panels will be built. So if you put this in context of the town of, most of this is in the town of Caledonia in Livingston County, but just knowing the scale of the river and looking at the field, you can see the extent of, you know, how these projects are going to occupy the landscape. And now the next slide. This is my third and final example. This project is located in both the town of Elba and the town of Oakfield in Genesee County. What you're looking at there is the parcels that are included in the project right now are in yellow. The area shown in white is where solar panels are actually proposed to be built. And just for scale, you know, look at the bottom of the slide and you'll see the outline of the village of Elba and the village of Oakfield. You know, this is going to be a major swath of land that if you were driving through, I guess I should have calculated, but I didn't, you know, how long it would take you to drive through that area and have the solar panels kind of in your view shed to either side. So I was just hoping to illustrate with this brief presentation that solar is coming, and it's coming in a very big way. As my job working with the towns and counties is to give them a sense of what, you know, the magnitude of these projects is and how it might affect things like agricultural land or soils or visual resources, noise, that kind of thing. And with that, I think I'll just stop here and pass the baton to my fellow panelists, or back to you, Kent.
Thank you, Cathy. That's really appreciate the graphics and the slides. It gives us a much better ability to visualize what this means. So now I'd like to move on to talk with Ross about offshore wind.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me, Kent? Did I guess?
We
Okay.
hear you, yeah.
Okay, great.
Go ahead and share your screen.
I'm not able to share my screen at the moment, Karen. But as we start and Karen gives me the ability to do that. Oh, I can do that now. Great. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. Kent, thank you for the invitation to speak here today with everyone in the Rochester area about offshore wind. My name is Ross Gould. I am Vice President for Supply Chain Development at the Business Network for Offshore Wind. So I'll be discussing this historic once-in-a-generation opportunity to build an industry, create economic development and jobs while confronting climate change. For about the last decade, I've been working to share information about offshore wind and prepare people and businesses to participate in offshore wind supply chain. In my role at the network, I oversee supply chain expansion and evolution. The network's mission is to advance the development of offshore wind renewable energy in the United States through education, innovation, and collaboration of public and private stakeholders. The network is solely focused on growing offshore wind renewable energy and its supply chain in the United States. The network has hosted 81 different networking events and have brought together 9,000 individuals from over 1,950 companies to discuss and focus on offshore wind. We currently have over 350 members. Now, offshore wind is not new. It's actually been in operation for well over 30 years. Offshore wind is the construction of wind farms in bodies of water to generate electricity from wind. Offshore wind energy uses proven but evolving technology that has been deployed for more than 30 years in different parts of the globe. The first offshore wind project was installed in 1991 off the coast of Denmark at Vindeby. In Europe, there are now more than 5,000 grid-connected offshore wind turbines across 12 countries, an industry large enough to employ 40,000 people. Now, the UK has installed the most projects, but China is quickly catching up. Now, wind turbines is not a new concept. We've heard a little discussion about how the people in Rochester, Genesee Valley have already experienced and do see some land-based wind farms in some areas. Steuben County is one of those areas. And although offshore wind may look similar to onshore wind, it is actually its own unique industry with a longer development timeline and much, much larger components. And because the turbines will be out in the ocean, there is a special coating applied to offshore wind farms, wind turbines, to help protect from the harsh marine environment. So they look the same, but quite different. As you can see here, you're getting a quick look at the comparison of wind turbine heights. The 8 megawatt and 12 megawatt turbines are the ones that will be being installed over the next few years. And as you can see their size in comparison to both the Statue of Liberty and the Washington Monument. Now, this is an illustration of offshore wind project under construction. Now, I want to note it's not to scale. And so you would not be seeing those turbines as close to shore as you're seeing here. But this is meant to just give you an idea of the parts and pieces of what goes into construction and of an offshore wind farm. You can see a port facility where you have laid down the parts and pieces, the blades, the towers, the nacelles that are then loaded onto cranes and taken out into the ocean to be installed. Using, if you can see my mouse here, surrounding here, these are specialized jackup vessels that create docks, flat surfaces in the ocean to be able to install the pieces. Now, why are we here talking about offshore wind? Well, we're talking about offshore wind because of job creation. Job creation is one of the most important factors in the growth and adoption of offshore wind. The offshore wind industry supports 40,000 jobs in Europe, and that was with only installing 18 gigawatts of offshore wind. And there are many jobs in offshore wind because it's a very large and complex industry. There are over 8,000 component parts needed for an offshore wind turbine and over 500 different categories of products and services required. And what you're looking at on the left is what is our business networks, our supply chain wheel. And those are the different parts and pieces, the major parts and pieces of an offshore wind project. The outer hub is the tier 1 pieces. You have the tower, the foundation, the nacelle, the blades, all of the pieces that you're familiar with seeing when you see an offshore wind farm. Now, we're also talking about offshore wind energy because it's a green alternative critical to resolving growing environmental problems. And it also presents the opportunity for billions of dollars in revenues that can be shared among supply chain companies. Now, offshore wind makes a lot of economical sense. Why? Well, as can be seen here, you're looking at the East Coast through 3 maps. Offshore wind is very, very compelling for a host of reasons other than the jobs and the environment. One, as you look at the left here, it's demand for electricity. The map on the left depicts a nighttime view that shows the vast demand for electricity along the East Coast. In fact, 38% of the population lives on the East Coast of the United States. And I also want to highlight, obviously, since we're based here out of Rochester, when you look at the Great Lakes over here, there's also significant demand. You can see Buffalo and Rochester highlighted with demand, little lights on the side there. Now, this middle map you're looking at is the Great Wind Resource that is been dubbed by some, the Atlantic Ocean has been dubbed by some as the Saudi Arabia of wind. The purple and red, as you're seeing up here in the northeast, are some of the greatest sources of, and the most consistent and best sources. And as you look over to Western New York as well, again, you can see again that purplish color, which depicts about 8.5 to 9.0 meter per second wind speed, which is a great resource for offshore wind. So Great Lakes, we are coming, and there will be wind turbines in the Great Lakes. And then finally on the right, you're looking at the shallow outer continental shelf, which makes attaching fixed bottom offshore wind less expensive and easier for capturing the wind source, the wind resource. So where are we right now in the United States? Well, there are currently 2 operational projects in the United States, the Block Island Wind Farm with 5 turbines off the coast of Block Island, as you're seeing on the left, and the CVOW, the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, which you're seeing construction on the right, which has 2 wind turbines. This is a nascent industry that is on the precipice of significant growth. So, you know, as I said, there's just the 2 projects, but many projects are under development. You're looking at here a map of states on the eastern seaboard that have committed to purchasing offshore wind. States up and down the East Coast have committed to 11.6 gigawatts of offshore wind, which is roughly the equivalent of 19 average coal plants or 14 average natural gas plants. Here's a map of the actual leases under consideration. What's important to note is that you have 15 areas that are in the middle of project development and right now. They are in the middle of doing their permitting process and seeking to receive construction and operation plan approval from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the agency that oversees our deployment of offshore wind on the outer continental shelf of the United States. Now, the network is also anticipating that we will see additional wind energy areas in South Carolina and off the coast of the West Coast. And we are also, as I mentioned, confident that we'll be seeing additional offshore wind off of the Great Lakes in the coming years. Now, just to sum it all up, and to move on to let Dan get an opportunity to speak here, and then to move into additional questions. Offshore wind is a once-in-a-generation economic opportunity to build a new industry. We can grow jobs while also protecting the environment and making electricity cleaner and more reliable. So thank you, and I look forward to the opportunity to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ross. Appreciate it. And thank you, participants, for sending in some of your questions. We'll get to some of them when we can. We also have some questions that were sent in through the survey that we sent out yesterday. So now let me pass it to Dan to talk about PlugPower and hydrogen fuel cell.
Great. Good afternoon, and pleasure to be here with everybody. I wanted to talk a little bit about PlugPower. We are currently the leader in hydrogen and fuel cell technology. We're the first to create a market for hydrogen fuel cells. We have done over 31 million refuelings. We produce 30 tons of liquid hydrogen that we use every day. We've got 40,000 forklifts out in the field. Our Gen Key is an end-to-end solution that provides fuel, hydrogen infrastructure, fuel cells, and service. We're expanding into electrolyzers and green hydrogen and liquefaction plants via acquisitions. And we will have the in-house capacity to become one of the largest green hydrogen generators over the next several years. We have a pretty solid customer base between Walmart, Amazon, Home Depot, Wegmans, Lowe's, Kroger's, Uline, Honda, General Motors, and many others. And we've currently found that about savings of about $900,000 annually for a typical distribution center with around 200 forklifts in terms of conversion from their existing technology to fuel cells. So it's a significant savings for the consumer. The US is really coming back to the Paris Accord. We really want to tackle climate change. It's good for American jobs and good for business. I think it provides us with energy security, making renewables cost competitive. And then America's innovation and leadership in clean technology is really important for us to maintain on a global scale. nations around the world are continuing to look for hydrogen and have aggressive plans to include hydrogen in their energy policies. There's currently 14 countries that are really pushing hard for hydrogen to be a main part of their plans. There are 5 main uses for hydrogen in the world, and most of them are these 5 around power generation for grid balancing, use hydrogen for transportation fuel, for material handling and other vehicles. There's fuel for industry in order to power industry. There's feedstocks for industrial processes around the refining and other internal industrial processes. And this fuel can be used for residential and commercial buildings by adding it to the current natural gas supply up to 10 or 15%. So lots of uses for hydrogen out there. And hydrogen also provides the most promising long-term carbon-free seasonal storage. So if you want to store energy for long periods of time and reuse it, hydrogen is the best solution, and that's why so many of the countries are looking into hydrogen and hydrogen storage for energy consumption. As renewable electricity costs continue to come down, our generating costs to produce hydrogen will follow. And if we can use the green electricity produced from renewables, we can make green hydrogen. The global electrolyzer capacity is expected to increase steeply over the next several years, based on all the reports we've seen. Here's one from McKinsey that's talking about 1,400 megawatts of electrolysis capacity is expected in just the next 4 years here. So that's a 30x increase over where we are today. So the electrolyzer business will be pretty extensive going forward. We are currently building the first green hydrogen generation network across the United States. So we'll be able to produce hydrogen at multiple locations. We want to get up to being able to produce 500 tons a day by 2025. We've already selected 7 sites across the US where we're going to install our hydrogen production facilities. And we're looking to add 3 more in the central and western part of the United States. We'll put down our 1 megawatt electrolyzer systems right next to a liquid plant where we can deliver the assets for hydrogen out to various applications. Our first greenfield site is right here in the Stamp facility in Genesee County. It's a $272 million project. We'll create 68 jobs. It's 128 megawatts of green hydrogen using green electricity from Niagara Falls. And that project will be completed mid to late next year. It includes electrolyzer plant, the ability to store gas and then liquefy that gas and then transport that via our tractor trailers for delivery. We're also producing the world's first PEM technology Gigafactory right here in Rochester. We will be able by 2024 to output 1.5 gigawatts of power. We make 7 million membrane electrode assemblies and 7 million bipolar plates. 1,000 megawatts of electrolyzer. We'll have the ability to produce green hydrogen on site and make over 60,000 fuel cell stacks. That will allow us to transform from our current manual process for assembly to our high volume automation in our manufacturing facility at the Gigafactory. The Gigafactory will be a $125 million project, creating 377 people, new jobs here. It's a 155,000 square foot facility. We just signed the lease January 1st and in the process of expanding it. PlugPower is going to expand our manufacturing capability to meet our $1 billion sales goal in 2024. So we're right on track to do that. All the equipment is on order. We'll also be a showcase innovation center where we'll bring in local universities and other companies and suppliers to co-locate with us to be able to help generate the jobs as well as the training for new employees. We also recently signed a joint venture with Group Renault to be able to start to put vehicles on the road in Europe. And that joint venture will be our hub for replicating the Gigafactory in Europe and be able to supply all of Europe through Group Renault for delivery vehicles that run on fuel cells and hydrogen. And we'll generate the hydrogen there with our electrolyzers. We also have just recently signed a joint venture with SK over in Asia. They're in South Korea. That will allow us to, again, replicate the Gigafactory and provide electrolyzers and fuel cell systems for the industry in Asia. So we continue to rapidly expand. We're currently working with companies in Australia, as well as other parts of Europe and Africa, to be able to expand into those markets as well. So we think that the hydrogen and fuel cell industry is really poised at an inflection point, where all the signs are that we're going to continue to increase production, as well as make hydrogen a ubiquitous fuel on a global scale. So that's where we are. We're driven by New York State support. We have 40,000 units in the forklift industry. We have 100 hydrogen refueling stations across the United States. We'll very shortly be able to drive from an Amazon or a Walmart or other distribution centers all the way across the United States, getting fuel at every one of those warehouses where our forklifts are operated to be able to get hydrogen fuel. We have our Gigafactory Innovation Center going in Rochester, and we will have over 1,000 jobs in New York State by the end of this year. So that's where PlugPower is, and we're happy to be here in Rochester.
Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate that overview. Congratulations on what you've been able to achieve with American Fuel Cell and now with PlugPower. It's great to see you still involved and working in our community. So let's. I'm going to go back to Cathy and Ross and talk a bit more about this permitting process. I mean, one of the things that Article 10 did, and what is it, 94C? Have I got that?
Yes, you do. You have that correct.
Yeah, 94C. What it does is, frankly, it takes local government out of the loop, right? You know, I think everybody's an environmentalist until there's a wind turbine a mile away, right in their view shed. They used to be able to, look at the distance something or other, and now they've got this windmill in their view shed. Is that why we've seen a move away from local control? Are there other reasons why the state has gotten involved? And then Ross, after Cathy has spoken, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the federal process and how that works.
I think that is the primary reason, Ken. Things were just not, projects were not being approved at the local level. Either opposition groups would form and have a pretty vocal presence during the local review processes. And I think the state was watching. They weren't seeing many of the projects getting built. They kept ramping up their goals, but they still weren't seeing projects being built. So they, starting with Article 10, moved to a statewide approval and siting process, and now have moved to an accelerated statewide process. I think of it, when I was working on the earlier projects, I could see the problem with the regional approval. I mean, it was, if one or two people at the town level didn't like the project, it could be killed pretty readily. So, and meanwhile, the need for the power is state and regionally based. So there was a disconnect there, and I think that's really the state goals, and as they kept increasing, a better way had to be found.
Yeah, so we're not talking about changing the setback requirements for residential homes in the community, which is something that affects only people in the community. This really affects people at a statewide scale, and therefore the notion is that the state should have more authority.
Right, the benefits are statewide.
The benefits are statewide, but I think the locals would argue that many of the costs are local. Benefits may be statewide, but the costs are local.
Yes, and that's
this is painful for some people.
That's the tension, right?
And I think too, you point out that we have a process in place, and this applies to affordable housing, lots and lots of other areas where, if you really want to slow something down, the way our planning and zoning rules work, you can slow something down for a very long time.
Yes.
So Ross, federal level, how does the federal government get involved in dealing with offshore wind?
Well, at least this is everything I'm talking about is prefaced on it being siting and permitting being done on the outer continental shelf, okay, which is the zone 3 miles or further out off of the coastline. That's when it becomes federal waters, and that's when the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, comes into sight. So It's a long drawn out. It's a robust process for citing and permitting of an offshore wind project off the coast. You first have to get a wind energy area identified, and so a project developer tells the BOEM that it's interested in developing an area, and then a process for calls for notice have to go out to a broader group saying, hey, a project developer has interest. Do you also have interest, or how do you use this site? Does this interest conflict with your current use? And so an analysis is done and a look to see what kind of uses for that area. And then after an assessment for what kind and a public comment period for what type of uses, it then goes to an auction. The area is identified and a lease would occur. At that point, the project developer, there's a lease auction that occurs. The winning project developer then signs a lease. Then they do an initial site assessment. And that's just taking a look and doing an initial assessment and survey of the conditions out there. What type of wind speed, what are the soil assessments, the survey of the soil, because you have to place the foundations on your seafloor. You need to get an assessment of what the seafloor looks like. And then marine mammals and a whole bunch of siting and environmental studies are done as well. And that's a site just for your initial assessment. After an initial assessment period, yes.
I think we can cut a little bit of the detail. Let's just stay at the top level.
It's a 10-year process.
Yeah, but the feds control it. Isn't that really the issue?
Yeah, the feds do control it. However, then also there is state permitting as well, because as I mentioned, you have to get the power to shore. Yeah. And so once you come within that 3-mile area, then you turn over to, in New York, the Article 7 proceeding, which is siting of your transmission. Okay. So there's over 23 different permits that a project needs to get in order to be built.
Okay. So Dan, question to you. Some people on the who are participating in the forum have asked that you explain a little bit about why hydrogen is a fuel. We burning it? Is green hydrogen? Can you see green and see brown hydrogen? I thought hydrogen was clear. And then the other question I think that's related is, what are the barriers to developing an infrastructure that will allow people to use the hydrogen in their fuel cell vehicles? So if you talk a little bit about how fuel cells work and why hydrogen is a source, as a storage of energy, and how you actually get energy out of it.
Well, okay, there's a lot of questions in there, but I'll give some
high-level stuff. But
quick background. Hydrogen is very abundant in the universe, so it's readily available. It's normally attached to something else, so we have to break it apart. As in water, you have hydrogen and oxygen. What an electrolyzer does is you take water, you put a little electricity in, and it breaks apart the hydrogen and oxygen. You store the hydrogen and can use it for fuel, or you can use it for industry. But today, a lot of the hydrogen is produced from natural gas. And when you take natural gas, it has a carbon element. When you break apart natural gas to get the hydrogen out, you're left with this carbon. And so the carbon atom attaches to the oxygen and becomes CO2. And so we really don't want to do that. So we'd like to get away from cracking natural gas into its components and to do an electrolyzer. So a green hydrogen is produced when you take a renewable electricity source like wind, solar, Niagara Falls, and you put that into an electrolyzer and crack water apart into hydrogen and oxygen. There's basically no carbon involved in that. So we've taken the carbon out of the equation. So that's why we call it green hydrogen. A fuel cell actually does kind of the reverse of an electrolyzer. And what that does is it takes the hydrogen gas and combines it with oxygen from air back together again. And when you do that, you can make H2O, which is water. And when you do that in a fuel cell, you produce water, heat, and you also produce electricity. So we're taking the electricity back out. So hydrogen is actually a great storage vehicle for energy. You can crack it apart when you have lots of renewables or lots of excess capacity on the grid. You can break apart water and store the hydrogen. Then when you need electricity, when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing, or we have a drought and there's no water going over the Niagara Falls, you can convert that hydrogen back into electricity. And hydrogen can be stored at pressure, so you can be very dense. So you can get a lot of power out of that stored hydrogen. And so for long duration usage for backup power and those kinds of things, you could store a lot of hydrogen, and it would be less space than a bank of batteries that would be required to provide megawatts of power for long duration. So that's why hydrogen is an excellent energy storage medium.
So your lift trucks, for example, you got 40,000 lift trucks out there. Just like a car, a normal internal combustion engine drives around with a little tank filled with gasoline, and we burn the gasoline, and then it generates the energy. You've got the same issue with the fuel cell, right? You've got a tank that's going to hold the hydrogen, and then you use the hydrogen, and that in the process combine it with oxygen and create some electricity out of it, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the case, except there's no emissions from that process. So
right,
all it's water vapor is all that comes out.
Yeah, I know that terrible water pollution that comes out the tailpipe, right? It's so the challenge, I know, and it's true for electric vehicles that are battery operated, is developing that network of hydrogen charging stations, right?
Yeah.
So how do you do that?
Well, that's a great question. There are 12,000 gasoline stations in the United States. Some corners have 3 or 4 on them. So you don't really need all of them as you start to build up this infrastructure, and as you start to build up the volume of fuel cell vehicles on the road. You only need an occasional station to have hydrogen because of the long range and the fast refill times. One station can service a lot of vehicles. But I really think what's more important is everybody asks where the hydrogen stations are today, and really there aren't any, but where's the hydrogen? And we're actually putting in the hydrogen infrastructure today at all of our warehouses. We have hydrogen available. We produce hydrogen locally. You can pull up to any one of those warehouses across the United States. You can take a semi-tractor trailer and go from Walmart to Amazon and deliver goods or pick up goods and get hydrogen in every one of those warehouses. We currently have hundreds of those warehouses across the United States, and we're continuing to add more. We're going to add 40 new Amazon and Walmart sites this year. And so we continue to sort of silently put in the hydrogen infrastructure across the United States.
Well, that's interesting. So you're actually accomplishing that through your other business, which is the lift trucks, right?
Correct.
You got to have hydrogen at those facilities anyway. And so then you're kind of turning those things into gas stations, quote unquote, the
correct
hydrogen equivalent.
Particularly for tractor trailers, they'll be a great place to refill right where they're unloading and loading.
So the what I'd like to do next, Karen, if we can flip to the slides of the survey. We did a quick survey yesterday, and we had some very good response. And I thought some of the answers are interesting. First question we asked is, of the Biden energy policy, do you think it's too aggressive, about right, or not aggressive enough? And we found that 44% of the respondents, it says something about our audience. Obviously, this is not a stratified random sample. 44% of the respondents thought that the policy should be more aggressive. Only 12% thought it should be less aggressive. Next slide. Then we also asked about carbon tax. As an economist, I'm a great fan of the carbon tax. We economists like to tax the bad stuff as opposed to specifically subsidizing the good stuff. We think it's a more efficient way of moving resources from one use to another. But in this case, we saw 44% strongly agree with support for a carbon tax, and 43% are simply agree. So that's very strong support. Next slide. Wind turbines. Ross would be pleased to see that we have 83% of support, 83% people saying that they're kind of okay with wind turbines on Lakes Ontario or Erie that could be easily visible from the shore. Now, Ross, I know you've talked about the fact that when you're doing these things way out into the ocean, that they're not visible. But if you're talking about Lake Ontario or Lake Erie, it's probably more difficult to make them quite invisible. But at least within our sample set, there's a lot of support. Next slide. And then we ask people, the money question. I'd be willing to pay more for electricity if it hastens the transition away from fossil fuels. Well, we had a lot of support for alternative energy policy, a lot of support for research, but alternative fuels should be price competitive, said 40% of our respondents. 33% of our respondents said, well, I pay a premium, but not more than 15%. Final sign. Then we took a look at those people who said that the policy should be more aggressive. I'd be willing to pay more for electricity if it isn't transition. Well, 23% of even that group that's supportive of a more aggressive push for alternative fuels and more aggressive push for climate policy. Only 23% thought that alternative fuels should be price competitive, and 32% said their premium would only be up to about 15%. So that kind of reminds me of the quip that everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. But let's go back, Karen, to Q&A. Question that came in off of our survey was about other sources. There's one question about whether there is more hydropower capacity in New York State. Another question asked about the use of geothermal, whether geothermal isn't a resource that we could exploit and expand. And then finally, a couple of other respondents asked about nuclear power. So who'd like to respond to those?
So I'm happy to jump in. In terms of geothermal, your geothermal's major use is for conditioning of your home, your heating and cooling of your home. And that couples greatly with renewable sources of electricity like offshore wind and solar. If those are the ones that are feeding into your home, the electricity you're getting, and then you're making heat with the heating and cooling of a geothermal system, you're having you're moving to a zero carbon home.
And to a large extent, yeah, that's going to displace natural gas in much of the Northeast. I think it's heavily used for heating, right? Mm-hmm. So, anybody would talk about nuclear? Nobody wants to talk about nuclear. Well, I'll make a quick comment. I mean, there are a lot of people who are, point out that the current, that there are some designs out there for nuclear power that are dramatically safer than anything we have, and even arguably that the number of years we have with nuclear power suggests that even the old designs were remarkably safe. So there's a lot of support out there among certain wonky minority for nuclear power, but they are enormously expensive. And you think about the siting problems you have with a wind farm, and that pales in comparison to the kind of siting challenge you have for nuclear. And then water power, any ideas whether we have any excess hydro capacity in New York?
I know that in New York State, we have larger hydro power capacity than most states. More of our energy is supplied in that way than the average state in the US. And I'm not seeing a lot of push towards that. I see the solar is probably the biggest push, and the wind maybe next, and certainly storage. But there's just not a lot of activity. It's mentioned every once in a while, but there's just not a lot of activity regarding hydropower as a upcoming source.
So what about the technology to remove carbon from the atmosphere? So on the one hand, we're talking about putting less into the atmosphere, but there's already a lot there. What about our ability to take carbon out of the atmosphere and address the climate change problem that way? Any thoughts?
My major thought on that is transitioning to a renewable source where we're not putting any in there in the first place would be is a proven. We have proven technologies. You're looking at 3 people on a screen that have proven technologies to provide electricity and or energy or transportation without an introduction of any carbons. So let's look at our already existing technologies that can address these issues and be applied at mass scale, which it looks like the Biden administration is seeming to do, and we'll be hearing more, I think, tomorrow. And by the way, happy Earth Day, everybody.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Ross. So I think that, I think that's a really good point, that we've got some established technologies. We know a lot about these technologies. We know what it's going to take to make them, put them to scale. So, that perhaps is more certain than some of the other things we could be doing. There's a surprising amount of interest relative to just a few years ago in geoengineering, however, The National Academy of Sciences just came out with a report recommending that we launch a major research project looking at geoengineering. Geoengineering would, of course, be one of the things that would reverse the effect of global, greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. But that is a challenge. Final question. We're kind of running out of time here. Is around this pocketbook question. The Yale survey suggests that support for climate change policies falls the closer we get to people's pocketbooks. And our survey just demonstrated that as well. That while people say, sure, I'm all in favor of being more aggressive about our global warming problem, but don't charge me more for it. And yet, that's really the way all the policies work. I mean, anyone thinks that we can push alternative fuels at this point without actually providing some level of subsidy. Ross, I know that the offshore renewable energy credits that were recently issued by the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. I mean, those credits are talking about paying as taxpayers or as ratepayers about $25 per megawatt. So some of the subsidies are fairly substantial. I think that, I don't know what the subsidies are for solar, but they're considerable. And certainly the state support for PlugPower's expansion is not inconsiderable as well. So we really are having to put out some significant money, but people do get reluctant about that. I mean, I wonder, how we overcome that reluctance.
Well, I mean, we're not hearing a lot of people talking about the money that our taxes are already being used for to subsidize the oil and gas industries and allowing drilling on public land at much lower prices than they would have to get in other places. So there are significant subsidies already embedded into our system for the existing fossil fuel industry. And in terms of costs, the trend in Europe that's been seen is, and what we're seeing so far in the US is that offshore wind energy the cost will fall over time and sometimes dramatically. And in fact, as I said, Europe has been installing them since 1991 and is a much more mature market, and they're reaping the benefits of the cost benefits. Right now, they're seeing bids that are cost competitive with other forms of technology. And as we start deploying scale here in the United States, we will see those exact same benefits. In fact, a report I just saw said that that they think that the costs for offshore wind are going to continue to fall over the next 30 years at significant rates, and we're going to reach a point where it's less expensive to do offshore wind than any other form of electricity.
Yeah, and I think those incentives for the early adopters are what really help you get to economies of scale to bring the cost down and get it competitive. I think that's exactly the way you want to do it, is to get cost parity as quickly as you can through those early incentives.
Even the solar industry, I mean, this community solar initiative, the 145,000 small community solar plants, those things I assume are pretty heavily subsidized, although I've not seen them.
They are. And, if you had asked me or many other people 15 years ago, should we have solar in upstate New York, especially looking at our weather today in late April here, the answer would be, no, that's crazy. But, if you subsidize and the technology will then improve and there's a push and a support to get the technology to a level where it's either self-sustaining or, needs just a little bump subsidy. But without that, it would be business as you can't just keep doing business as usual. So you're changing the whole economy, the gas stations like we talked about, and the whole setup, the physical capital setup in our country. That's going to need some subsidy to change.
And and Kent, you're an economist. The other aspect is the fossil fuel industry are not internalizing their externalities, which means they're not paying the cost for the public health impacts they're associated with their technology or the environmental impacts of their technologies. Which, if you put into the cost and socialize that cost,
yeah.
it would be cost competitive, if not cheaper, for solar and wind right now.
Yeah. So once again, I mean, we economists love carbon taxes and putting taxes on that discourage the bad stuff. has the effect of encouraging the good stuff. So any final comments before we close? We're almost out of time here. All right, well, thank you to our panelists. And I want to be particularly grateful to Canandaigua National Bank and to the Pollution Prevention Institute, and also to Karen Hyder, our coach and our coordinator that kept the trains running on time and helped us make this thing successful. And thanks to you for registering and for logging in today. With that, we'll bid you a good afternoon.